It's our great pleasure to have with us Dr. James Gomez, who has done some amazing work in terms of really exploring the intersections between academia, politics, activism in Singapore, and more broadly in Southeast Asia as a region. Dr. Gomez right now is Chair, Board of Directors of ThinkCentre, which is a not-for-profit organization that seeks to create human rights impact across Southeast Asia. With his doctoral work, once you completed your doctoral work, you entered into academia. But you came into academia after having worked for many years in the activist context. But what really is interesting, James, about sort of your trajectory is how then you went, sort of moved back into the political space and moved through it, sort of within the context of the Workers' Party and the Singapore Democratic Party, or the SDP. You're the convener of the Asia Centre's upcoming conference on fake news. But this conference is just one example of the many interventions that we have created across sort of your career span, producing think pieces and concept pieces that help us grapple with Southeast Asia and the politics of Southeast Asia. So it's our pleasure to have you with us, James, and look forward to conversing with you in the next hour, really thinking through your journey into academia, politics, and activism. So maybe let's begin by asking this question in terms of your interest in activism and change. What is it that got you interested?
Well, I guess coming from Singapore, I first got interested when I went into the National University of Singapore. It was 1988. Tiananmen Square was happening around us. So one of the things I noticed was the lack of attention or curiosity around Tiananmen issues. So I was wondering, sitting in university, how fellow university mates in Singapore were indifferent, really, to what was happening. So I tried to muscle up some support to see if we could sign a petition in support of the students, who are under severe threat. But I had a hard time, rustling support because most people were afraid, and this was in almost 30 years ago. So I decided, therefore, I will just set a table up and put a few pieces of paper, made up a sign, and say, here, sign up a petition, in support of the students, who are under severe threat at Tiananmen. And to my surprise, a whole line of people actually queued up to sign up. So it was then I realized that, within the Singapore landscape, and being at the university, which was a microcosm of Singapore society, that something was not quite right. And I wanted to understand what is it that, kept people away from active citizenry, and participation. So from then on, my next few years at the university was, getting involved in student clubs, with the student unions. I organized a range of talks that included, inviting opposition politicians to the university. At that time, the biggest gatekeeper was the student liaison officer or office, which I had to negotiate because every talk that I organized and person I invited outside of the university required pre-clearance from the university liaison office. Any publications that we put out also needed to be vetted. One incident was around the interview conducted with the former long-time detainee, Dr. Cha Thai Po, who at that time in '88 was interned at the island of Sentosa. So I wrote to the ISD to ask whether there was any protocols that I had to observe to undertake an interview with him, and I got a letter back from the department saying that he's actually free and one can go and speak to him. So me and another student went to speak to him, and we got hold of the interview, we published it, but still that had to, go through the university liaison office for vetting. So this was kind of, life at the university. My biggest kind of end of university experience was when I wrote my honors year dissertation on the Asian values, and I had two diverging marks, one first class and one third class, and eventually the dissertation had to go abroad to Australia actually for adjudication, but by the time, I had decided that, I will proceed with my postgrad studies, and then went on to the UK, yeah. So that was my early days, yeah.
Lovely. So, I mean, just in this snippet, you have offered so much insight about different facets of Singapore. Let's first go to the National University of Singapore context. So, when you started thinking of Tiananmen and put up the table, at that point, were you aware of the history of student activism in universities in Singapore, and particularly at NUS, and the state's response to that activism?
I was just a kid, I wasn't really aware of. I did do some reading and understood that, figures like Cha Tai Po, there was that, urban myth or legend about one should not get involved in political stuff, and most of the political institutions were depoliticized, and the student body was very, very decentralized. Especially when you talk about the students' union, it was a decentralized way of elections. So it really disempowered you. You couldn't mobilize students for action. That was one dimension, but you also had situations where the local university lecturers, not all of them, but some of them actively would discourage you from participating. And I had, a couple of meetings really where I was asked to concentrate on my studies and not be involved in, all the student activities because it will not do me any good in the long run. But the fact that, you are actually called in and, firmly counseled that as a student, you're subject to that power relations, that your head of department would wield over you, and the kind of impact it will have possibly on grades, which I found out in my final year because, academia, at least the Singapore-based academia is biased, politically biased. And that what I took away from my time in NUS, that when it comes to anything Singapore and academia or political in nature, it is biased. And how do you navigate that afterwards? Yeah.
Fascinating. So, this goes to my question I had about your thesis. So it's really interesting that you produced a thesis on Asian values, and this is also the time when the state was producing these think pieces or intellectual pieces through many different avenues, so whether Kishore Mahbubani or Bilahari Kausikan, talking about Asian values and launching that on the global imaginary. Within that context, your critique was very powerful in terms of interrogating that logic. So I guess, the question I have for you is sort of in an academia that you say is fairly politicized in a way that the expectation is that you would produce academic work in a particular tone. What gave you the conviction to interrogate that overarching logic?
I think I was not motivated by any form of conviction. I think it was just the methodology of the work. What I did was a content analysis of civic education of primary and secondary school in trying to ascertain, what kind of values transmission was being engineered by making, students, young people, compulsorily go through civic education and examining. And what came out quite clearly was the strong emphasis on this Confucian values and ethics that preached, obedience, adherence to authority, and that kind of set, quite aligned, with the kind of larger Asian value discourse. So it was the methodology and the rigor that brought the necessary results, as opposed to having some kind of conviction that drove the results. So I guess to some extent it was the methodology and the findings that it produced that was seen as problematic. Yeah.
So, this is great because sort of I see conviction as conviction in the rigor of the science or the rigor of the social science. So one has to believe in the method and the ability of the method to cull out or to bring out, whether it is themes or whether it is patterns in social formations that sort of speak to the nature of the science. So I guess, but that is juxtaposed against the way in which academia is structured in Singapore, as you said, that, the messaging that you have to be biased because that is tied to the rewards and punishments that you would have in your career, it's pretty evident as well. So I guess my question is, let me reframe it a little bit. What sort of gave you the momentum to stick to your methodology and to stay close to it vis-a-vis sort of giving into the implicit pressure that you have to sort of frame whatever your findings are in a particular way for those to be palatable?
I think if you engage with the academia, especially in terms of social sciences within the Singapore context and within the Singapore platform and institution, I think you only understand the problem once your methodology reveals the results. So in this case, it is the findings that are problematic, right? So once the findings are problematic, then the researcher is then positioned as someone who is, veering into the political, when that may not be the set out intention. The intention is essentially is to investigate an area, perhaps an interesting area, that may have, some political, they can create some political understanding. But it's the findings that are problematic. So once the finding doesn't sit with the perceived, political ideology or trajectory, then that has to be challenged or disciplined. The finding has to be disciplined into what is acceptable. Yeah.
And that's what you refer to as the bias.
Yeah. Because and the researcher is then, painted as the biased one, because the finding, reveals something that is not part of the larger state narrative. Yeah. So because all findings, need to feed into the state narrative, and if there's an anomaly in the finding, then it has naturally, it's either biased, or then the methodology, is found to be guilty of, coming up with a rogue finding. So it's very interesting in terms of, how the states and the agents of the state will react to research and methodology. Yeah. If they cannot accept the finding, they will find a quarrel, or they will quarrel with the process and the methodology. Yeah.
So when I think about what you narrated, your experience, which year was this with your thesis?
This was 1992.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I think about my experience in 2016, 17, so that is um, 2 decades plus, but the theme seems to be the same, which is sort of, once you come up with your findings, which don't fit with particular ideologies, the dominant ideologies, that's when the research comes into question in variety of ways. This, of course, also certainly plays out in the work of P.J. Thum when we look at sort of his questioning of the Marxist conspiracy. And again, the ways in which those findings then don't sit with the overarching ideology. So let me connect this to the question of academia. And again, how I read conviction is in terms of, as an academic, what do you do with those findings? So for you then, when you sort of found out through your explorations in terms of the ways in which the Asian values ideology works, what did you then decide to do with those findings, learning that that didn't sit well with the overarching ideology of the state?
First of all, I think just to sort of put things into context, it was an honors year's thesis. It was not a public document. The thesis still has not been published. And the storm in the teacup was very much within the political science department, and the curiosity it brought among the academic staff, and a little ripple effect on the student. So it's really not a big deal. But for me, I think what it was how to find ways later on in life to go past the census and to to disseminate the findings of your work directly without any gatekeepers. And I think that's what I took away from the experience. One, there is a bias, or there are challenges to independent work and to findings that are different from the state narrative. And two, how do we get those findings out? At that time in the early 90s, the internet was still not onto us. It first slowly began to be available in Singapore and a little bit in the region only after 1995. And of course, this then leads me to my next stage, which is really, so after university in 1992, I went on to the UK and studied human rights at University of Essex. And when I came back to Singapore 2 years later in 94, I began crafting my first treatise, as I call it, which is Self-Censorship, Singapore Shame. And at that time, I had the internet on my side, and I was able, after a few years of thinking and writing and observing, to come up with a book, which was self-funded, self-published, and self-marketed. And that broke all barriers, because you could really bring the thoughts directly to the market, so you don't need the gatekeeper.
What impact did that book have?
Well, I think that really kind of put me on the map as far as Singapore political landscape was concerned, because there was no filters at all. Any filter I had was informal and just what the book, subscribed or describes, that, this will be problematic, so I had people who are generally concerned, and almost everyone that I met in the Singapore context said, you shouldn't publish this, right? But because you could get it directly to the market, so to speak, so you could bring your sort of, thought process out. So I used the website that was based in Australia to advertise the book. And I had a mail PO box, and so people wrote to me and said, "Hey, this is the money, for the book," and I just mailed them a copy. And one of the first few people who wrote in to ask for 2 copies of the book was the Ministry of Home Affairs in Singapore, right? So in late 90s, it already alerted to me to the fact that the ministry was actually reading, alternative websites, including this one called Singaporeans for Democracy, based in, I think it came out of Australia at that time, and they were, because there's no way they could get access to the book. The other option was direct sales. I actually went to a flea market in Clarke Quay and shared a mat with somebody else who was selling something, and I had some books on sale and sold a few copies. Then I took copies to the different bookshops, and one of the bookshops called the MPH, they ordered 200 copies, and I had a book launch, and it was covered in the local media, and the book broke all records. I think eventually made it to the top 10 in the first 3 weeks, and I sold out the first 2,000 copies. It was selling in Kinokuniya, and it was amazing the things I heard in the bookshops in that first week. You would hear people walk up to the counter, "Where's the shame book? Where's Singapore's shame?" And then you'll hear the counter staff calling out to another colleague, "Can we get Singapore's shame?" And it was just used both in Kinokuniya, in MPH, and it was amazing that so many people came for the launch, and also how the market consumed with fervor what is in their eyes some form of forbidden fruit. The book doesn't really say much apart from just describing what it was. But the fact that you don't put pen to paper and publish it, I think is the act of recording what is in the discursive domain that I think broke the barriers. Of course, the book has a final last chapter where it says how to organize, and the book brought to me many people who kind of believed in the trajectory. And a few months after the book, because these were people who wrote letters to me in the PO box, and I called for a meeting, and from then I established ThinkCentre. Yeah.
So, at this point, James, I mean, you had completed a bachelor's, you went for a master's. Were you thinking about academia as an option? And if you were, did you think about what publishing the book would do regarding your career opportunities in academia in Singapore?
No, I think at that point I was quite clear that the Singapore institutions is what it is. It's if those of us who read philosophy or different literatures, one of the book I think that explains Singapore quite well is Luis Althusser's ISA, the instrumental state apparatus, which is the reproduction of the ideology, and it was clear that if you had a different approach, the system would not want you in, because the whole system is about a gatekeeper, right? So we all have one life, so I didn't want to kind of waste my time trying to get into a system that is fairly closed, in relation to academia, right? So that thought didn't cross my mind, because I was free. The world is my oyster. So having done that book, I was working in international NGOs for many years. So I continued that, in Singapore and later being posted to Thailand. So it was the work that drove me to do the PhD, because in my work, a lot of it has to do with field work, research, action research, working for development agencies. So I was doing a lot of writing. I had a lot of field experience from the region, so I found myself being invited to universities, sometimes to give guest talks, like notes from the field, and also sometimes to run courses. So I thought if I was also already writing, publishing, and also teaching at universities as someone from a practice track, to me, I felt it didn't take too much more, since I was already writing and I had field knowledge, to just sign up for a PhD and have that done as well, so that where appropriate, I could also be part of the university or a research institute, because they do have certain criteria, such as having a PhD before you join them. So for that reason is why I took up a PhD. Yeah.
So, I guess one question that comes naturally is, did you, as you followed that path through, did at any point of time you try to apply to Singapore institutions, think tanks, for a potential academic career?
Not so much as a career, but every time I went through a stage in academia, I always try to take a bearing, because as much as one discounts Singapore, it's also good to know that whatever you say is verified. Because otherwise, I think when one critiques, you must have a basis on which you critique. So for every step, for my master's, I actually applied to the NES Political Science Department to do my master's, indicating I'll pay my fees, but I was not accepted. But I was, accepted at University of Essex, was, doing human rights. So, yeah, I went. For PhD, I actually applied to do. My PhD was in, sort of media law, new media and law, looking at Southeast Asia with a special study of Singapore. I applied to the NTU School of Communication. My PhD was also, application was also rejected. But however, I had two offers, one from the law faculty at Hong Kong U, and at Monash University. I took up Monash University. And I also applied for a type of a kind of a postdoc fellowship also at NUS. I think it's the arts faculty, later in, I think, 2010 perhaps, yeah, after my PhD, and that also didn't come through. But of course, at each juncture, that I applied, I always had a very astounding parallel overseas success. For my PhD, I had a scholarship of 100,000 Australian dollars from the Australian government that covered my fees and my tuition and living expenses. So I did quite well, and in terms of a postdoc, I got a full-time job at Monash and several other universities, including the role of associate dean. So I was always able to strike it good elsewhere, and so it never really bothered me so much. But I did, gauge, like every step I moved, what was the Singapore response? Yeah, and it was always predictable.
So let's go back to the book. When it was published, did you get to have opportunities of interacting with Singapore academics on the book? Because so much of it is about self-censorship, and academia is one side of self-censorship. So did you have interactions with Singapore academics? And if so, how did those interactions usually go?
Uh, well, I had a couple of interactions before the book was published, and most of the interaction was no, don't do it, right? Nothing on the substance of what was said. But if you're talking about writing and producing, my experience with Singapore academics are always twofold. One, they will either assume you are or make the claim you are an activist, or you have participated in opposition politics. So therefore, you are not eligible to participate in anything that is academic, because academic has to be neutral and non-activist. So there's that perception. So they keep you out. They take the versions of being a pure academic, and they bend over backwards to demonstrate their methodology as being very academically sound and even superior. So they protect that space. Now, this also includes those persons who may have similar views with regards to the state of academic freedom in Singapore, but still see academia in a very, very narrow sense. So that I think is one of the challenge.
Now, I just want to walk us back a little bit. You began with the premise that academia in Singapore, and particularly the way the social sciences are organized, is inherently biased. So I find it quite an irony that activism, or the linkages with activism, is seen as biased and therefore a threat to the neutrality of academia. And yet, the so called neutrality of academia is constituted within a biased, ideologically framed structure. So, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think those who occupy the space of, extreme neutrality or extreme academia, they do so as a mark of defense, because they seek legitimacy. They need to be part of the Singapore institutions. And even in spite of their neutrality, their methodology produces results that are in contradiction or an antithesis to the state narrative. So these academics can't help themselves, because the methodology has led them to that finding. So no matter how much academia veneer they throw on themselves or their work, it is the finding that still ostracizes them. And many times they find themselves pushed out from these institutions. And then they spend the rest of their life, most of them, trying to crawl back or claw back into the state institutions, because they lust this legitimacy of getting back to the Singapore academic institutions. One for legitimacy, one for the brass tacks of being at home in Singapore, where family is, and of course, and the wage, which is, comparatively much higher, to places around the region. So they spend the rest of their life, seeking to enter in one form or another, even if they are based overseas, and they are on sabbatical or fellowships, they will want to get a desk or space at one of these institutions, and many times they're not given any space, because as far as the state and its collaborators are concerned, we don't want to legitimize you whose findings are antithesis to the larger narrative come into our platforms, because our platforms are about this narrative. Yeah.
So I'm going to push this a little bit more because from this it seems like the very notion that activism threatens or reduces somehow or minimizes academic rigor um, is actually a false justification in many ways, because what I hear you saying is that the veneer of neutrality is just that, to keep intact a state ideology through the production of the social sciences.
It's an indirect, I mean, they keep this veneer of academia so that they can legitimize themselves as being truly, impartial, independent, and purely academic. So whatever their findings, which may be anti-state, should be accepted because it comes from that neutral platform. So anyone who's seen as an activist who may wear their issue on their sleeve is not welcome, because that methodology, that neutral methodology, is affected. But I think the state is more about the narrative, because even if it's a quack methodology that comes up with its findings that suits its narrative, it will absorb it, right? So that's the reading. So, but in a similar way, I think when we talk about academia, we also should speak to civil society, because civil society, to some extent, is not very different from academia, because they also, use the placard of neutrality. So for the civil society groups, what is problematic is they would not want, and we have to discuss the other dimension, who's gone to the political opposition, standing for elections and so on. So while you have academia and activists, then you have civil society, who then problematizes the political. Whereas just as in academia and civil society, there's that kind of movement, there's also movement between civil society and the political, right? So again, they self-compartmentalize, and that's part of the problem. Yeah, and that speaks to my experience standing for elections, because whenever you stand for elections, the civil society groups feel a great discomfort. It's even more problematic for the academics to embrace, someone who's gone into the political platform. But that's very much a Singapore phenomena. If you look at the rest of the region, whether it's Indonesia, Malaysia, or Thailand, you have this porous movement of people, and that's what contributes to the dynamic landscape. Yeah. Yeah.
So there are two questions that come out of this. One is when you sort of problematize the civil society to politics movement, again, I hear you bringing up the term neutral. So as if you lose your neutral ground when you enter into politics. Now the question is, increasingly you see in the context of Singapore that movement not only within the context of opposition, but also within the context of the PAP. So the question is that would the same kind of labeling hold for, say, a civil society activist that decides to become a PAP politician? Do they also lose their neutrality then?
Yes, they do. They do, but I think the civil society groups may feel a certain comfort um, if they have some access to the ruling party, because they ultimately want legitimacy from the state for whatever it is. And that's the end goal, right? So the civil society groups are issue driven. So if the state can accept that issue and move that issue forward, and they have access to it, the civil society groups will be fine because it fits the agenda. But for the politician within the ruling party, then it's about whether that issue fits into the narrative of that state. And and it's quite complex also for that individual concerned, because how much risk taking that particular person would do, how close they want to be with this issue pushing, civil society groups. So those are things also to be considered from that perspective. But broadly, the civil society groups may veer to the ruling party easily than they would with the opposition, because they want to move on the agenda. Yeah.
Now, this brings me to the second question. You said that in the region, you see the kind of fluid movements between academia, civil society, politics, not so much in Singapore. So why do you think that's the case?
I think all these groups have bought into the narrative of being neutral, right? And the rigor of methodology as a mark of your neutrality in the case of the academia. So they buy into this logic, but the methodology produce different results. That's the problem for the academia, for those in social science. So they try to be neutral, they do their work, they employ the methodology, but the findings are different. Now, unless they do not want to study those areas that give them an alternative findings, then they may have to do stuff that provides finding that is part of the state narrative, and there are people who do. And the civil society groups also want to be neutral, and for them the neutrality is defined by not being in politics, right? So they don't take up political issues. However, when they do non-political issues and they touch on areas of neglect that state policies doesn't cover, but then it's problematic for the state because it exposes the underbelly of what they are doing, and then that becomes a problem. So that's why they become the victims, of the state. Yeah. So here we are talking about whether it's LGBTI issues or migrant workers issues, or the abolition of death penalty, which what the bulk of the civil society groups work on, not so much civil and political rights. But even those are problem areas because it doesn't fit neatly with the agenda of the state. Yeah. So the methodology of neutrality of these groups not having people from politics being involved, but still, as far as the state are concerned, it's political.
Right. So in that sense, it also seems, though, that the very concept of neutrality, particularly within the context of Singapore, is itself an ideological production.
Which is reproduced by these academic and civil society groups, and they can't see where's the problem, I think. Yeah. And they struggle. Yeah. So, and it seems in any time soon they can't break out of this mental hold.
Now, with your work, one of the things that is most interesting in how you were constructing this narrative is that then you went on to do your PhD, and in that journey came ThinkCentre as sort of a space that is not trying to find legitimacy within that structure, but creating an alternative avenue. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
So with the PhD, I think after the PhD, I obviously got into the academic space around the region, and what I observed in the region was that, especially for social science, there were increasing challenges around the region. Social scientists were used to bringing civil society activists to their classroom to give a talk from practice perspective, to give sometimes even run half a course or a whole course, or have conferences that were convened where civil societies were part of it, and so on and so forth. But increasingly, this was problematic. It was seen as political. As the regimes around the region also became more conservative, and there was a slide back towards authoritarianism, you find that the space at the university was increasingly being restricted. Often not directly by the state, but by the gatekeepers such as the head of department, the deans, the vice chancellors, who will question. They had two reasons. One was the political dimension, and the other one was the cost dimension. Why are we hosting a civil society seminar here? What's the value for our students or academia or for the cost? So that was one challenge. Secondly, in terms of actual courses, programs, and research grants, these were also becoming thin for the social sciences, and especially those who are investigating, democracy, human rights, civil society, politics. So that was one problem. So Asia Center was set up, and it's been, it was a project that was conceived, some 7-8 years ago and been running now nearly 4 years, was to respond to that problem. To say, hey, why do we really need the university? It's only for legitimacy. Some claim for branding, and I'm a believer of building brands. And I said, no, all we need is a space, because what do? We convene people, we have an exchange of views, and we produce knowledge. So I don't think we needed the university. Then it comes to the secondary question. Now, how do you make it sustainable? Right? So if you look at civil society have largely been dependent in many cases to granting, re-granting, fundraising methodology. So, but some of this is running dry. So we decided to take a social enterprise approach where, we run a prudent, organization that relies on a mixture of funding, but also to generate income and to be a partner of the university to implement research, teaching, and so on and so forth. So this is the model we have been experimenting. And in the last 4 years, we've been getting some traction around the region. And I'm hoping that this may be a pathway in the short to medium term.
So I want to again, rewind a little bit and talk about ThinkCentre. Do you want to, maybe before going into the Asia Center trajectory, talk about the work with the ThinkCentre, and then your entry into politics within Singapore?
Yeah. So ThinkCentre was constituted as a business. It was able to do so because it didn't take the Registrar of Societies route. The law was silent, and we used the business to organize events, basically. It went on to a new law around public meetings, and also the Political Donation Act, which says that any entity, regardless whether it's a business, if its work is deemed to be political, then it will be gazetted as a political association, and it will be subject to funding restrictions, where you can't get foreign funding and so on. So when ThinkCentre was eventually gazetted, what it meant was it was no different from a political party in terms of all the limitations and so on. So it was then I thought, well, if that's the case, then joining a political party and standing for election is a no-brainer, because the state has brought you into the political, right, by default. Yeah. So then you naturally push me into that realm, and I accept. Yeah. So I think that's been the Singapore trajectory, right? So the state actually wants to politicize all the spaces that is not producing knowledge or results that is part of the state narrative. So it politicizes those spaces and calls it bias, and then it suppresses you or contests you, or says it's illegitimate or is a threat to the state. So it victimizes you, right? And then it tries to delegitimize you in the eyes of the public. So that's kind of the Singapore trajectory, and I think all the actors have to deal with this, but and of course different people have different level of stamina and emotional strength, but I think you need resilience to soldier on, and solidarity. So part of, I think, the next stage of the Singapore work would really to highlight to those people on the front line that one, not to be affected by the emotional fallout, because that's inevitable, but to build resilience. So from an emotional point of view, to build resilience, and also if you are not getting solidarity, because you won't, that's the reality, instead of looking for solidarity within, it's good to look for solidarity outside. So when people are looking at Singapore from the outside, and if they want to help the individuals who are speaking up to find resilience, then they should, show solidarity with the affected individuals, so they have that kind of courage which they can't really get in Singapore. They do get some, but not enough, so they can soldier on. Yeah.
Beautiful. So, we came back to this whole neutrality thing once again. So it's amazing how this is a recurrent theme. It seems like there is a binary, neutral versus political, that is consistently deployed to silence any form of critique in that sense. So I guess within that setting, then, if neutrality is constructed as opposition to what would be political, how do you go about challenging the narrative?
Yeah, I think to challenge the narrative, one has to throw out the yokes of neutrality, right? And just say, look, we share a different set of values, and that's what it is. And we've got to work, campaign, build solidarity, get people behind it. It's a different policy position. It's not about being neutral. And I think if you, and to some extent, this neutrality also affects media, right? But the media in Singapore is biased, right? So I think for the academia and civil society, I think those actors, who participate in extreme neutrality, and if in being in that space, and their work is showing something else that is antithesis to the state narrative, I think you got to embrace that finding and take that finding and walk it through as a policy recommendation, because ultimately that's the value. But if you are unable to do so, and then I think that work is not effective because the findings must mean something, right? I mean, you need to change it to policy action, and if you don't want to walk it through, then you need to partner with those people who will walk through the findings, and that means connecting to civil society, connecting to political parties, right? Because they are the one who will bring it forward. So I think that's the connectivity that's needed, and without that connectivity and realization, it won't work. Yeah. So
It also seems that the whole concept of neutrality is defined by the state. So, what is, if you ask the question, what is the operational definition of what makes something neutral? That operational definition is held in the hands of the state.
yeah, it's basically neutral according to whom, non-partisan in relation to whom, right? So that's what they have to figure out, and I think these both the academia and civil society groups who partake in this can't help themselves because they are products of the socialization. They can't zoom out to see otherwise. Yeah, yeah.
Let's now talk a little bit about your entry into politics. So, the ThinkCentre experience offers a backdrop to your entry into politics within the context of the Workers' Party and then the SDP. So do you want to talk about that experience a little bit?
It's a different experience because it's in the raw. For the, the experience, whether it's the Workers' Party or SDP, is the same. Is you meet the public. You meet the public, a very aggrieved public, and they want their voices to be heard. And it's electric experience, and I think one needs to touch the people, including shaking hands and being able to speak or converse in multiple languages, because it is a downtrodden in Singapore that really need the support. Yeah, you'll find generally, the upper middle class, they don't really engage so much. They engage in this intellectual, like, what can you do for me? What's your policy position? But to a large extent, politics is also emotional. So you can rationalize it to a point, but then you got to make the leap of faith. So that was like the human experience. There's also political party intrigues. Every organization has that jostling for position. I was seen as a minority candidate, which I never subscribed to. I always say, I'm James Gomez. I'm nobody's minority candidate, and I've never stood as a minority candidate. Yeah, so I always carry my own as far as my position in Singapore politics is concerned, and I don't allow the opposition parties that I'm part of, and also the electorate to define me as a minority candidate in relation to the PAP speak. Yeah.
Now, one of the things in that election process, of course, you had to go through the experience of being interrogated by the police and sort of having to navigate that. So, how was that experience like?
Yeah, this largely is centered around the 2006 election and the quarrels over the minority form. I mean, my position is I think nobody should be filling out any minority form. And in my case, I was not a minority candidate in any case. There were secret recordings that were not publicly informed. So I think in terms of processes, this was not transparent. You'll find in many places, in many countries, they will tell you surveillance cameras are working or in operation, or you're being recorded for training purposes, not at the election department. Part of the problem is it's only in the last few elections that people actually got to know more about the elections department. It's under the Prime Minister's office, it's not independent. After every elections, including the incident, they now have signs about that they have surveillance camera, and they also have rooms in which candidates can privately process their application forms and not in the glare of the media, as it was in my case, to report or misreport incidences. After all, the full videotape of that incident was not played and only snippets of it. My participation in public life from the time of ThinkCentre was always that I will be sitting in jail. So from day one, I try to work out in my mind, where will this land up? And, where will I end up with this? So in the Singapore playbook, right, you end up in jail, sitting indefinitely, either as a bankrupt or incarcerated under detention without trial for a long time. So I had to come to the mental acceptability that that's where the logical conclusion would be. So to some extent, I was, psychologically prepared. Secondly, I think it's also my personality. I'm not prone to extreme. I'm quite a steady Joe. And I was able to handle a lot of stress, and a lot of it was just noise. So you just ride it through. Yeah, so I think these two things, helped me navigate the process. And the third one was also just being self-reliant. Yeah. As much it'll be helpful and useful for anyone to have solidarity, but I was not expecting solidarity. So and that's how you do Singapore politics. So if you get the basic in order, everything else you get extra as a bonus. Yeah. So I think that helped me quite a lot.
So again, it comes back to those two concepts, solidarity and resilience. Now, I want to ask a little bit more about this idea of solidarity, because in many parts of the world, I think about the US, I think about India, activists have many spaces of solidarity that they can draw upon in order to find strength. Singapore, like you're saying, seems to be limited in that sense. Why is that the case?
Because again, we come to definitional issue. We spoke about the notion neutrality, right? And we applied it to academia, we applied it to civil society, and it showed the disjuncture between academia and civil society activists, and then after between civil society activists and political parties, opposition parties in particular. And now we've got to cluster all of that together between the Singapore parameter versus the foreign parameter. So when we are talking about cross-border transnational solidarity, as was in the case of a place like East Timor, which is small, and Singapore would need to follow that model, then again you have another boundary created. This is a Singaporean business, right? So, well, good on you if you get some local solidarity. I mean, let's see who will come together, right? Because everybody is afraid. But I think where you have options for solidarity is transnational and cross-border. So they have problematized also the other, the non-Singaporean, as foreign. So that narrative comes in, and that's why that solidarity has not really emerged. But we need to think about it. But in thinking about it, one has to also be mindful that that negative, anti-Singapore, dimension would also come into play. Yeah.
So resilience is the other construct. Do you have any advice, suggestions for the next generation of activists, civil society workers about how to sustain resilience?
Yeah, I think what I think is to develop solidarity among their peer And to understand these are the parameters, and also to build cross-border solidarity is very important. The challenge with a lot of the young people is they are unable to self-sustain in terms of jobs and so on. Almost every activist who's frontline, doesn't have a job and has to do part-time or depend on family. Now, because the region is small and you're close by, you could get employment around the region and still have a good life and be involved. So in order to do that, they need to build cross-border alliances and solidarity. And you don't have to go far. There's plenty nearby next door. Now with developments in Malaysia, one of the things that we need to look for is how to build that solidarity and relationship in Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand as immediate counterparts.
So I'll come to one last question, James, as a way for wrapping up the themes we have been talking about. Now, one of the things you hear consistently being argued, at least in the Singapore literature, is how human rights is a Western discourse. It doesn't really work in Singapore. Or how contentious politics is a Western discourse. It doesn't really work within the context of faith, Confucianism, and Asian values. I would, given all your years of experience, I would love to hear how you conceptualize these ideas, whether you think these are Western ideas, or do you think that they have meaning within the context of Singapore? If so, how so?
Yeah, I think it's not so much west or east, north or south, but I think it's a methodology. I think, first of all, we have to determine your audience and what your audience is willing to listen, because we can send messages in many forms and many mediums, but if the responder is not receiving, your message is not going through. So I think what is needed is audience analysis. So whether it's the Singapore state, whether it's another state in the region or elsewhere, I think we need to know where are the entry points for articulation. And really, it's a mixed methodology. There are times you need to use the media and publish your findings. There are times you need to do briefings at your ministries. It's time to shake the hand of a politician, or there's time to do joint public action, with civil society groups. So it's a multiple prong. And part of the challenge is to counter the narrative of the state. So it's also an intellectual exercise. So one needs to be philosophical, intellectual about having a counter narrative to the hegemonic narrative, right? So I think that's where I would see it coming from. Yeah, a multi-pronged approach. Yeah. Based on how you get your audience to listen. Yeah.
Thank you, James, for spending this 1 week with us and sharing so much of your insights. And CARE is looking forward to working with you and Asia Centre. Do you have any parting thoughts for CARE?
No, I as we have had discussions, I think what I like about the work of the CARE, which we certainly want to take on board, is we use the term, participatory approach, but I think you really go a step further and you include the community, you take directions from the community, and I think that's very powerful. And that's something that we want to kind of incorporate in our work and learn from. But what we can bring to the table is, walking the findings, so to speak, and having the findings, put forward to the audience in a variety of mediums and approaches. So I think I see a very complementary approach, and that's what I'm hoping, the duet will realize. Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. James Gomez, we are looking forward to the partnership with Asia Centre, and particularly to seeing how we can contribute to your imagination of creating alternative spaces across the region that can contribute to the struggles for justice. Thank you.